An elegant ballroom transforms into an emotional minefield when violence shatters the veneer of sophistication. Before dozens of witnesses, a pregnant woman is publicly assaulted by her own husband, a man of unshakable prestige. But what seemed like just another silenced episode takes an unexpected turn when a bartender intervenes, revealing a secret capable of destroying reputations. That night, she stops being merely a victim. She rises as a survivor and finally begins building her own freedom. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. The ballroom of the Grandeur Hotel in London shimmered under the light of imported crystal chandeliers. It was the most anticipated night of the year in London's corporate world, the British Business Leaders Association Awards Gala, and Marina Albright felt every muscle in her body protest against the tight navy blue silk dress she had insisted on wearing. 6 months of pregnancy made any social event a physical challenge, but that particular night demanded much more from her than just enduring the discomfort of high heels and a fabric that seemed to tighten with each passing minute. Beside her, with the impeccable posture of someone born to command, her husband Richard Maxwell chatted animatedly with a group of investors. He wore his best tuxedo, the calculated smile he reserved for important occasions, and that tone of voice Marina knew so well, the voice that told people exactly what they wanted to hear. Richard was the CEO of Maxwell Developments, one of the largest construction companies in the country, a man who had transformed the surname inherited from his grandfather into a synonym for luxury and exclusivity in the British real estate market. Marina discreetly held the side of her belly, feeling a sharp pang that made her close her eyes for an instant. The baby moved frequently that night, as if it could sense the tension emanating from its mother's body. She took a deep breath, forcing a polite smile when one of the businessmen's wives approached to comment on her dress. The woman was Beatrice Finch, wife of one of Richard's company's minority partners, and she had that particular way of turning compliments into small barbs wrapped in kindness. Marina responded with automatic courtesy, thanking her for the compliments on her appearance, while internally counting the minutes until she could sit down. Her back throbbed, her feet seemed to pulse inside the tight shoes, and the feeling of being observed by dozens of critical eyes never left her for a second. Richard gently pulled her by the arm, guiding her to another group of guests. He needed her by his side, the perfect wife, pregnant with their first child, the complete image of the successful man who had built an empire from scratch. Marina knew her role in that scenario. She knew him very well after 4 years of marriage, 4 years in which she had learned to decipher every expression on his face, every subtle change in his tone of voice, every sign that preceded a storm. Across the ballroom, behind the polished mahogany bar, Gabriel watched everything with meticulous attention. He wore the black waistcoat of the bartender's uniform, prepared drinks with precise movements, and maintained a professional expression that revealed absolutely nothing beyond cordiality. But his green eyes, so similar to Marina's, followed her every move across the room. Every time she discreetly touched her belly, every time her smile wavered for a fraction of a second, every time Richard held her tighter than necessary. Gabriel Albright knew his sister better than anyone in the world. They had grown up together, only children of Paul and Helen Albright, owners of one of the UK's largest luxury hotel chains. Marina was 2 years older, always the most careful, the most responsible, the one who mediated conflicts and calmed storms. Gabriel was the impulsive, the creative, the one who preferred to make his own rules. But something had changed drastically when Marina met Richard Maxwell. Their courtship was a whirlwind, 6 months that felt like a hurricane of romantic dinners, trips to Paris and New York, expensive gifts and promises of a brilliant future. Richard was charming, successful, came from a traditional family, and his parents had approved the relationship with enthusiasm. The wedding took place in a grand ceremony at Richmond Manor in Surrey, with over 400 guests and coverage in 3 society magazines. But Gabriel had noticed the subtle changes, the way Marina started cancelling lunches with the family, how her calls became more spaced out, briefer, more controlled, how she smiled less, talked less about herself, always seemed to carefully choose every word. He had tried to talk to her, but she assured him everything was fine, that she was just adapting to married life, to the responsibilities of being the wife of an important businessman. It was 6 months ago, when Marina announced her pregnancy, that Gabriel decided to act. He didn't confront Richard. He didn't force Marina to admit what he already suspected. Instead, he used the resources he had inherited from the family to do something completely unexpected. He bought a stake in the Grandeur Hotel, taking a strategic position on the administrative board, but keeping his identity hidden through a shell company. Then he simply presented himself as a bar employee, using documents that concealed his real surname. No one knew who he really was. To the staff, Gabriel was just another efficient bartender. To hotel guests, a friendly face behind the counter. To Richard Maxwell, when he occasionally frequented the hotel bar for informal meetings, Gabriel was practically invisible. Exactly as he had planned. For 6 months, Gabriel observed, he saw Richard treat Marina with indifference in public, only to shower her with compliments when he noticed they were being observed by someone important. He saw how he controlled every aspect of her life, from the clothes she wore to the friends she talked to. He saw the signs of a woman who was losing herself, slowly fading to fit the mold her husband had created. And that night, as he prepared a dry martini for a group of executives, Gabriel felt the weight of the decision he had made. Being there so close and yet so distant, seeing his sister struggling to maintain her composure, every cell in his body screamed for him to do something. But he knew he needed the right moment, the right evidence, the situation that would leave no doubt in Marina's mind about who Richard really was. Marina accepted a glass of sparkling water from one of the waitresses, sipping it in small gulps, while Richard lectured a group of Japanese investors about the development company's new venture, a luxury complex in the Scottish Highlands. She knew that speech by heart. She had heard it at least 20 times. The words blended in her mind as she focused on breathing, on ignoring the growing pain in her back, on maintaining the smile everyone expected to see. That's when she made the mistake. A small, insignificant mistake for anyone else, but not for Richard. She interrupted his speech to mention a detail about the project, a piece of information she had read in the report he had left on the Home Office desk. It was a simple, factual contribution, relevant to the conversation. Richard turned his face to her with an expression Marina knew all too well. Outwardly, he still smiled, but his eyes were icy. He ended the conversation quickly, excused himself to the investors, and firmly guided her towards a more discreet corner of the ballroom. Marina felt her heart race, her mouth go dry. She knew that pattern, that sequence of events that always ended the same way. Richard's fingers tightened on her arm with unnecessary force as he pulled her away from the groups of guests. Gabriel saw everything from the bar, every muscle in his body tensing, but forced himself to remain where he was. It wasn't time yet. He had to wait, however painful it was. Richard stopped near one of the enormous windows overlooking the hotel's illuminated pool. His face was red, the vein in his temple visibly throbbing. Marina tried to explain herself, her voice low and controlled, but he cut her off with a violent whisper that made her instinctively recoil. She apologized once, twice, trying to calm the storm she saw forming in his eyes. But this time it would be different. This time Richard Maxwell would not be able to control the rage that simmered beneath his facade of a polished, well-educated executive. This time he would make the mistake that would change everything. The music continued to play softly in the ballroom, an instrumental bossa nova version that violently contrasted with the tension growing between Marina and Richard. She tried to take a step back, but he held her wrist tightly, preventing any movement. His words came in short bursts, accusations disguised as concern, criticisms wrapped in the advice of a zealous husband. Marina felt tears threaten to overflow, but forced herself to hold them back. Crying in public would give him more ammunition, more reasons to say she was unstable, too emotional, unable to control herself. She had learned that lesson the hard way over the years, so she took a deep breath, tried once more to explain herself, her voice almost a whisper so no one else would hear. That's when it happened. Too fast for her to predict, too natural for him to think twice. Richard raised his hand, and struck Marina's face with a slap that echoed through the surrounding space like thunder in an open sky. The sound was dry, definitive, impossible to ignore. The impact made Marina's head snap to the side, her dark hair rippling with the movement. For a moment that seemed to stretch infinitely, everything in the ballroom froze. The music continued to play, but it seemed to have become more distant. Conversations did not cease immediately, but they dwindled in. Waves, circles of silence expanding from the epicenter of the violence. Marina instinctively brought her hand to her burning face, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath her trembling fingers. Her other hand flew to her belly, a pure, instinctive gesture of protection. The baby. She needed to protect the baby. The fear that overwhelmed her was so intense that for a moment she couldn't breathe. She just stood there, paralyzed between shock and terror. People began to turn, first those closest, their faces registering surprise, discomfort, a mixture of shock and embarrassment. Then the more distant circles of guests. As news of what had just happened spread in urgent murmurs, some pulled cell phones from their pockets, others simply watched with wide eyes. Richard immediately realized his mistake. His expression changed in seconds, from rage to something that tried to look like concern. He took a step towards Marina, his hands raised in a gesture intended to be appeasing. He began to speak loud enough for nearby guests to hear, his words coming out in a calculated torrent. He said it was an accident, that she stumbled and he tried to catch her, that she was exaggerating the situation, because pregnancy made her too sensitive, that everyone knew how pregnant women could be emotional, unstable, prone to misinterpreting things. His voice had that condescending tone Marina knew so well, the one that turned victim into culprit and violence into misunderstanding. But the ballroom was no longer his territory. The eyes of dozens of witnesses had seen exactly what happened. There was no stumble. There was no accident. There was a man hitting his pregnant wife in the middle of a crowded event, and no amount of well-constructed explanations could erase that image from collective memory. Gabriel left the bar, so quickly that he knocked over the cocktail shaker he was preparing. The clatter of metal against the mahogany counter made some guests turn, but he was already moving between the tables, his strides long and determined. He crossed the ballroom as if the other guests simply didn't exist, his eyes fixed on Marina. When he reached them, he positioned himself strategically between Richard and his sister. He said nothing initially, just stood there, a physical and silent barrier. Gabriel was only a few inches taller than Richard, but at that moment he seemed much larger. His presence completely changed the dynamic of the situation. Richard looked at him with a mixture of surprise and growing irritation. Who was this bartender to meddle in a private matter between husband and wife? He opened his mouth to order Gabriel back to his post, but something in the expression of the man in front of him made him hesitate. There was something in Gabriel's green eyes that seemed familiar, disturbing in a way Richard couldn't identify. Gabriel finally spoke, his voice low but laden with authority. He asked Marina to sit down. It wasn't a suggestion, it was almost an order, but gentle, filled with genuine concern. He gestured to one of the nearby chairs, keeping his body between her and Richard. Marina obeyed without thinking, her legs trembling so much that she was grateful to finally be able to sit. One of the waitresses, Julia, who had worked at the hotel for 3 years and knew Gabriel well, quickly approached with a glass of water and a cold compress. She handed both to Marina with a look of silent solidarity. Marina held the compress against her face, which still burned, her eyes meeting Gabriel's for the first time since he arrived. There was something in that look that made her feel a wave of conflicting emotions, gratitude, confusion, and then, slowly, recognition. She knew those eyes. She knew the curve of that jawline. She knew the way he slightly tilted his head when he was concentrating. But it couldn't be. Gabriel was in New York taking care of the family business. Or at least that's what she believed. Richard tried to approach again, his voice rising a tone as he demanded Marina get up and accompany him out of the ballroom. He needed to get her out of there, control the narrative, limit the damage to his reputation. But Gabriel moved again, maintaining the barrier between them, and this time his voice was firmer, clearer, loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear every word. He said no one would touch Marina, that she would stay there seated and safe until she was ready to decide what she wanted to do, that anyone who tried to force her to do anything would have to go through him first. The words fell like stones into the growing silence of the ballroom. The music had stopped completely now, and even the waiters had frozen in their posts. Richard felt his control of the situation completely slip through his fingers. He looked around and saw the faces of the guests, some shocked, others clearly judging, many discreetly recording with their cell phones. He saw Beatrice Finch whispering urgently with her husband. He saw Frederick Carter, a journalist from one of the country's leading news portals, making notes on his phone. He saw the president of the British Business Leaders Association, Dr. Lucy Rivers, observing everything with an expression of deep disapproval. The anger Richard felt was replaced by something more dangerous, desperation. He began to speak louder, trying to regain control. He accused Gabriel of invading privacy, of stalking, of manipulation. He said Marina was his wife, that he had every right to take her home if he wished. But his words sounded increasingly hollow, increasingly empty. Gabriel remained motionless, his eyes never leaving Richard's. And then, with a calm that contrasted violently with the growing agitation around them, he said something that made Richard's blood run cold. Gabriel said he had everything recorded, every second, every word, every gesture. The hotel's security cameras captured everything in high definition with crystal-clear audio. There was no denying it, no distorting it, no turning it into something it wasn't. The truth was preserved in pixels and digital data, unquestionable and permanent. Richard tried to laugh, a forced and artificial sound. He said a simple bartender wouldn't have access to the hotel's security cameras. But something in Gabriel's expression, in the absolute confidence with which he spoke, planted a seed of doubt. Richard looked around again, searching for allies, for someone who could reinforce his version of events. That's when Marina spoke for the first time since the impact. Her voice was hoarse, trembling, but there was a nascent strength in it that no one expected to hear. She said his name, just that, Gabriel. And in the way she pronounced that name, in the mixture of surprise, relief, and something that seemed like hope, Richard finally understood that he had lost much more than control of that night. The recognition in Marina's eyes was like watching an awakening in slow motion. Gabriel saw the exact moment she connected the dots, when the impossibility of it all began to make sense in a way that defied all logic. He knelt beside the chair where she was sitting, his eyes now level with hers, and for the first time in 6 months, he allowed her to see everything he had kept hidden for so long. Marina dropped the cold compress she was holding against her face. Her free hand reached out slowly, trembling, until it touched Gabriel's face. It was such a simple gesture, yet loaded with so much meaning that some of the closest guests felt the intensity of the moment as if it were palpable. She traced the line of his jaw with her fingers, touched the small scar above his left eyebrow that he had gotten at 12 years old falling from the tree in the family's backyard. The tears she had been holding back since the impact finally overflowed, running freely down her face. But they were no longer tears of fear or pain. They were tears of relief, confusion, a wave of emotions so complex that she could barely breathe. Gabriel held her hand against his face, silently confirming what she had already realized. It was him. It had always been him. For 6 months, while she felt completely alone, he had been there, watching, protecting, waiting. Richard watched the interaction between the two with growing alarm. The intimacy of that touch, the familiarity of that look, everything indicated a connection that went far beyond bartender and customer. His mind worked quickly, trying to process information, connect pieces of a puzzle that suddenly seemed much more complex than he had imagined. It was Gabriel who broke the silence, rising slowly but keeping one hand on Marina's shoulder in a protective gesture. He turned to face Richard and, for the first time since he arrived, smiled. But it was a cold, calculated smile, the kind of expression that promised revelations no one was prepared to hear. Gabriel spoke his full name, Gabriel Albright, and watched with satisfaction as recognition finally dawned on Richard's face. Albright. The same surname as Marina, the same surname as one of the most influential families in the British hotel industry. The same surname discreetly emblazoned on golden plaques in the lobbies of dozens of five-star hotels across the country. The information spread through the ballroom like wildfire. Growing murmurs, muffled exclamations, people checking their phones to confirm what they had just heard. Gabriel Albright was not just Marina's brother. He was heir to an empire, an entrepreneur who had been building his own reputation in recent years through strategic investments in technology and sustainable hospitality. He was on Forbes' list of young British entrepreneurs, had been featured on the cover of Business Weekly 3 months ago, and he had been serving drinks at that bar for 6 months. Frederick Carter, the journalist, approached with measured steps, his cell phone already discreetly recording. He knew an explosive story when he saw one, and this had all the elements of a headline that would dominate social media for weeks. But he was also experienced enough to know when to wait, when to let events unfold before asking his questions. Richard tried to regain his composure, but his voice came out louder than he intended, laden with a defensiveness that only confirmed his desperation. He accused Gabriel of invasion of privacy, of stalking, of manipulation. He said this was an elaborate setup, that Gabriel had always been overprotective of his sister to the point of obsession. He tried to paint a picture of a disturbed man who couldn't accept that his sister had chosen her own life. Gabriel let Richard speak, allowing him to dig his own hole deeper and deeper. When the other man finally paused to breathe, Gabriel responded with a calm that was even more devastating than any angry outburst could be. He explained, in a voice clear enough for everyone in the ballroom to hear, exactly why he had done what he did. He spoke about how he had noticed the changes in Marina, how she had gradually distanced herself from the family, always with perfectly reasonable excuses, how her phone calls had become superficial, controlled, devoid of the connection they had always shared, how he had perceived the subtle signs of someone who was losing herself, but couldn't ask for help because she believed she didn't deserve to be saved. Gabriel spoke about the decision he had made 6 months ago when Marina announced her pregnancy. He had seen the fear in her eyes that day, disguised as happiness. He had seen how she touched her belly as if protecting something precious from an invisible threat. And he had known, with a certainty that needed no proof, that his sister was in danger. So he had used the resources he had not to confront Richard directly, not to force Marina to admit what she wasn't yet, ready to acknowledge but to be near, to observe, to collect evidence of what he already suspected, and to be exactly where he needed to be when the right moment finally arrived. The room was completely silent now. Even the waiters had stopped moving, trays forgotten in their hands as they listened to every word. Marina cried openly, one hand still on her belly, the other clutching the hem of Gabriel's shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a world that suddenly seemed to be spinning too fast. Dr. Lucy Rivers, the association's president, approached with determined steps. She was a woman in her 60s, grey hair tied in an elegant bun, dark eyes that had seen much throughout her career as a lawyer specializing in corporate law. She positioned herself beside Gabriel, her presence adding another layer of authority and legitimacy to what was happening. She asked Marina directly if she was okay, if she needed medical assistance, if she wanted someone to call the police. Her voice was gentle but firm, making it clear that Marina had choices, that she was not alone, that there were people there willing to help her regardless of who her husband was or how much power he thought he had. Marina tried to speak, but the words came out garbled, cut short by sobs she could no longer control. Gabriel knelt beside her again, holding her hands in his, offering the anchor she so desperately needed. He didn't speak for her. He didn't try to decide what she should do. He just stayed there, letting her know she had all the support she needed, whatever decision she made. That's when Richard made his second big mistake of the night. Frustrated by the complete loss of control of the situation, furious at the public humiliation, desperate to regain some sense of authority, he lunged towards Marina. He tried to grab her arm, pull her from the chair, force her to leave with him immediately. Gabriel rose like lightning, blocking Richard's path with such force that the other man stumbled backward. But it wasn't just Gabriel who reacted. Dr. Lucy positioned herself between Richard and Marina with an expression that could freeze hell. Frederick Carter continued recording, capturing every second. And then, surprisingly, several of the other guests also moved, forming a human barrier around Marina. Julia, the waitress, stood beside. Gabriel. Carlos Mendoza, an Argentine businessman who was a minority partner in one of Richard's companies, stepped forward with his arms crossed and an expression of deep disgust. Beatrice Finch, who until then had observed everything from afar, approached and stood beside Marina, her hand gently resting on the younger woman's shoulder. Richard looked around and saw his influence crumbling in real time. All those people, many of whom had fawned over him for years, flattered his position, sought his favors, now watched him with a mixture of revulsion and judgment. He tried to speak, but his voice came out strangled, the words losing strength before they were even fully formed. Gabriel took another step forward, his voice low but laden with a promise that made Richard instinctively recoil. He said he had 6 months of evidence, not just from that night, but from other occasions when Richard had frequented the hotel. Phone conversations where he disrespected Marina in public, interactions with staff where he treated her as property, moments captured by security cameras that painted the complete picture of who he really was behind the polished facade of a respectable executive. And then Gabriel said something that made even Marina look at him with surprise. He revealed that he was not alone in that investigation, that in recent months, while observing and collecting evidence, other people had come to him voluntarily, people with their own stories about Richard Maxwell, stories he had kept buried through threats, manipulation, and strategic use of his position of power. The silence that followed Gabriel's statement was heavy, laden with expectation and tension. Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, but tried to maintain an upright posture, shoulders back, the expression he had practiced for years to convey unshakable confidence. But his hands trembled, slightly, a detail that did not go unnoticed by the attentive eyes around him. It was Carlos Mendoza who took the first step forward. The Argentine businessman, who had done business with Maxwell Developments for 3 years, cleared his throat before speaking. His voice had a heavy accent, but his words in English were clear and precise. He spoke about a joint project they had developed 2 years ago, a residential development in Punta del Este. Richard had manipulated the numbers, diverted resources that should have gone to quality finishes, replacing materials without informing buyers. When Carlos discovered this and tried to confront him, Richard threatened to expose Carlos's previous businesses that had grey areas in terms of taxes. Nothing illegal, but enough to tarnish his reputation if presented in the right way. Carlos had backed down, swallowed the loss of almost $500,000, and remained silent, until that night when he saw the same intimidation tactic used against a pregnant woman in public. Before Richard could formulate a response, Beatrice Finch also began to speak. Her voice was firm, but there were tears in the corners of her eyes. She said that Richard didn't just treat Marina that way. There were other occasions, other events, other situations where she had witnessed disturbing behavior. Once, at a business dinner at the Dorchester Hotel restaurant, she had seen Richard hold Marina's wrist under the table so tightly that it left visible marks. Another time, at a New Year's Eve party in the Lake District, he had publicly humiliated her for wearing a dress he deemed inappropriate. Beatrice said she was ashamed to have remained silent, that she had rationalized, convinced herself it was none of her business, that perhaps she was seeing things that weren't there. But now, seeing Marina with the red mark still visible on her face, knowing she was pregnant and vulnerable, Beatrice could no longer bear the weight of that silence. Frederick Carter, who continued recording everything, moved closer, his journalistic instinct capturing the historic moment. He didn't ask invasive questions, didn't try to turn the pain of those people into a spectacle, but he recorded, documented, preserved the truth as it was revealed layer by layer. Richard tried to counterattack. His voice rose several tones as he accused Carlos of theft, Beatrice of envy, Gabriel of manipulation. He said this was a conspiracy, an elaborate setup by resentful people who wanted to destroy everything he had built. But his words sounded increasingly empty, more desperate, especially when compared to Gabriel's firm calm and the growing solidarity of those present. Marina remained seated, observing everything as if watching a play where she was simultaneously protagonist and spectator. Part of her still couldn't fully process what was happening. 6 months ago, she had felt completely alone, trapped in a marriage that suffocated her, not knowing how to ask for help or if she even deserved to be helped. And now, surrounded by people willing to expose themselves, to risk their own reputations to support her, she felt something new growing within herself. It wasn't just relief, it was something deeper, more transformative. It was the slow but inexorable realization that she was not responsible for the violence she had suffered, that there was nothing she could have done differently, no correct way to behave that would have prevented it. The fault was not hers. It never had been. Gabriel noticed the subtle change in his sister's expression. He knew every nuance of that face, every small alteration that signaled the internal storms she faced. And he saw the moment when something broke inside her, when the invisible chain that held her captive finally began to snap. Dr. Lucy Rivers took out her phone and, with efficient movements, made a call. Her voice was low, but everyone around could hear fragments of the conversation. She was calling an ambulance, not for immediate medical emergency, but as a precaution. Marina needed to be examined, the baby needed to be monitored, and medical documentation would be essential for any future legal proceedings. When Richard realized what was happening, he made one last lunge. He moved quickly, trying to reach Marina before anyone could stop him. But Gabriel was faster. He intercepted Richard with a precision that spoke of years of martial arts training, an activity he had maintained since adolescence. There was no violence, no aggression. Gabriel simply blocked Richard's path and, with a series of controlled movements, moved him away from Marina without hurting him. The hotel security finally arrived, 3 uniformed men led by a middle-aged manager named Paul Henry. He assessed the situation quickly, his eyes going from Gabriel to Richard, then to Marina and the guests around. Paul Henry had worked at that hotel for 15 years, and although he didn't know Gabriel's true identity until that moment, he had always considered him an exemplary employee, someone who treated everyone with respect and professionalism. Gabriel exchanged a few quick words with Paul Henry, explaining the situation concisely but completely. The manager nodded, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. He turned to Richard, and in a voice that brooked no argument, informed him that he would need to leave the premises immediately. Richard exploded. He yelled that he was a VIP client, that he knew the hotel owners, that he would sue everyone present. He threatened to destroy careers, ruin reputations, use all the resources he had to make those people pay for that humiliation. His face was red, the vein in his temple throbbing violently, beads of sweat beginning to form on his forehead. That's when Gabriel finally revealed the last piece of the puzzle. With a calm that violently contrasted with Richard's growing hysteria, he said that the hotel owners were well aware of the situation. In fact, one of them was right there, present in the ballroom. Himself, Gabriel Albright, who had bought 45% of the Grandeur Hotel's shares 6 months ago through an investment company he maintained under a different name. The information dropped like a bombshell. Richard stood motionless, his mouth open, but no sound coming out. The guests around began to murmur again, some checking their phones to confirm the information. And it was true. Gabriel had not only worked as a bartender there, he was one of the establishment's main owners. Marina let out a sound that was half laugh, half cry. The irony of the situation was almost too absurd to be real. Her brother had literally bought a stake in a hotel just to be close to her, to protect her, to have the necessary control over the environment when the right moment arrived. It was excessive, dramatic, and completely typical of Gabriel when it came to protecting the people he loved. Paul Henry, now aware of whom he was really speaking to, positioned himself beside Gabriel with renewed respect and determination. He gestured to the 2 security guards accompanying him, and together they began to escort Richard towards the exit. Richard tried to resist, but was clearly outnumbered and, more importantly, had lost any semblance of moral authority he might have claimed. As he was led out, Richard continued shouting threats, promises of revenge, increasingly delirious accusations. But his voice grew more distant, until finally the elevator doors closed, cutting off the sound once and for all. The ballroom fell silent for a long moment, as if everyone was collectively releasing the breath they had been holding. Marina began to tremble uncontrollably, the shock of everything that had happened finally hitting her with full force. Gabriel knelt beside her again, taking off his bartender's uniform blazer and placing it over her shoulders. Julia brought more water, a thin blanket they kept in, stock for emergencies, and an additional chair so Marina could elevate her feet. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later. 2 paramedics entered with a stretcher, but Marina insisted she could walk. Gabriel helped her up, supporting her weight as they moved slowly towards the exit. Dr. Lucy accompanied them, as did Frederick Carter, who was still recording but now maintained a respectful distance. Before getting into the ambulance, Marina turned to look at the ballroom one last time. Dozens of faces watched her, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of solidarity and respect. She saw Beatrice nod, gently. She saw Carlos Mendoza nod in approval. She saw the hotel staff, people she barely knew, watching her with a mixture of concern and admiration, and for the first time in 4 years, Marina felt that maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to herself. St. Jude's Hospital was quiet at that hour of the night, with only the soft sound of occasional hurried footsteps and the rhythmic beep of monitors echoing through the corridors. Marina was taken directly to the obstetrics department, where a team was already waiting. Dr. Patricia Norris, an obstetrician in her 40s, with brown hair tied in a practical ponytail, greeted Marina with a gentle but professional smile. Gabriel tried to accompany his sister, but was gently prevented as the medical team performed the first examinations. He stayed in the waiting room, still wearing the black trousers and white shirt of his bartender's uniform, his arms crossed as he paced back and forth. Dr. Lucy had left after ensuring Marina was in good hands, but promised to return in the morning. Frederick Carter had also said goodbye, but not before leaving his card with Gabriel saying he would like to talk, when the time was appropriate. Inside the examination room, Marina lay on the gurney while Dr. Patricia performed a detailed ultrasound. The cold gel on her belly made her shiver, but she kept her eyes fixed on the monitor beside the bed. The black and white image showed her baby, the strong and regular heartbeats echoing through the room via the device. The doctor worked in silence for several minutes, moving the transducer carefully, checking every angle, measuring, noting. Marina involuntarily held her breath, her heart racing for reasons completely different from the last few hours. The fear that something had happened to the baby, that the stress of the night had caused some damage, was almost paralyzing. Finally, Dr. Patricia turned off the equipment and turned to Marina with a genuine smile. The baby was perfectly fine. The heartbeats were within expected range, the amniotic fluid at ideal levels, no signs of fetal distress. Marina let out the breath she was holding, tears returning to stream down her face, but this time they were tears of pure relief. The doctor carefully wiped the gel from Marina's belly and helped her sit up. Then, with the sensitivity of someone who had clearly dealt with similar situations before, Dr. Patricia asked if Marina would like to talk about what had happened, not in an investigative or intrusive way, but offering a safe space for Marina to process the events of the night. Marina began to speak slowly, her voice still trembling but growing in strength as the words flowed. She spoke about the last 4 years, about how the marriage that had begun as a fairy tale had transformed into a gradual prison. The first criticisms she rationalized as concern, the growing control over her clothes, her friends, her routine, the outbursts of anger that were always followed by elaborate apologies and expensive gifts. She spoke about the progressive isolation, how Richard had subtly alienated her from her family without her realizing it until it was too late, how he used guilt and emotional manipulation to maintain control, how she had begun to believe that perhaps she really was too sensitive, too dramatic, that the things that hurt her were exaggerations of her unstable mind. Dr. Patricia listened to everything without interrupting, only nodding occasionally, her hand gently resting on Marina's shoulder when the sobs became too strong. When Marina finally finished, exhausted from the confession, The doctor spoke with a gentle firmness that reminded Marina of her own mother. She said that nothing Marina had described was normal or acceptable, that controlling behavior, isolation, emotional manipulation, and physical violence were clear signs of an abusive relationship, that there was no excuse, no justification, no circumstance that made it Marina's fault. Dr. Patricia explained that she would document everything, that there were specific hospital protocols for cases like that, and that Marina would have all the medical and legal support she needed. When they finally allowed Gabriel to enter, he found Marina, sitting on the edge of the gurney, wrapped in a light blue hospital gown, her hair loose and falling over her shoulders. She looked at him, and for the first time that entire night, smiled. A small, tired, but genuine smile. Gabriel crossed the room in 3 long strides and enveloped her in a careful hug, mindful of the belly between them. Marina allowed herself to melt against her brother's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the familiar scent of his perfume mixed with the faint lemon aroma of the drinks he had prepared during the night. It was like coming home after being lost for years. They stayed like that for a long time without needing words. There was so much to be said, so many explanations due, so many unanswered questions. But at that moment, just each other's presence was enough. Marina finally pulled away, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, and looked at Gabriel with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. She asked how he had managed it, how he had planned everything so meticulously, how he had kept it a secret for so long. Gabriel sat in the chair beside the gurney and began to explain. He spoke about the day she announced her pregnancy 6 months ago, how he had seen the fear in her eyes, disguised by a smile that didn't truly reach her face, how that had been the final sign that he needed to act. He described the process of buying a stake in the Grandeur Hotel, how he had used contacts and shell companies to keep his identity hidden, how he had infiltrated as a bartender, a job that allowed him to observe discreetly without drawing attention, how he had spent 6 months documenting every visit Richard made to the hotel, every public interaction, every moment that confirmed his suspicions. Gabriel admitted there were times when he almost gave up the charade, moments when seeing Marina suffer was almost unbearable, when every cell in his body screamed for him to simply confront Richard directly. But he knew he needed concrete proof, a public moment where the truth could not be denied or distorted. Because if he acted too soon, Richard could use his power and influence to turn the situation around, to make Marina seem unstable, to isolate her even further. Marina listened to everything in silence, processing the extent of the sacrifice Gabriel had made. 6 months of his life dedicated to silently protecting her. 6 months serving drinks and politely smiling at people who had no idea who he really was. 6 months watching her from afar, unable to approach, just waiting for the right moment. She asked why he hadn't simply talked to her, tried to convince her to leave Richard. Gabriel sighed, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture Marina recognized as his childhood nervous tic. He said he had thought about it, but he knew Marina too well. She had always been the protector, the one who put others first, the one who minimized her own suffering so as not to worry the people she loved. If he had simply arrived and accused Richard, Marina probably would have defended her husband, convinced herself he was exaggerating. She would have pulled away even further, perhaps cut off contact completely to prove her marriage was solid. Gabriel needed her to see the truth for herself, for other people to witness it too, for there to be irrefutable evidence. Marina knew he was right. If Gabriel had confronted her months ago, she probably would have denied everything. Richard's manipulation was so subtle, so gradual, that she had normalized behaviors that any outsider would immediately recognize as abusive. It was only now, with physical and emotional distance, that she could clearly see the trap she had fallen into. They talked for hours, the night slowly advancing as they filled in the empty spaces of the past few years. Gabriel spoke about how their parents were doing, about the family business, about the projects he had been developing. Marina talked about her pregnancy, about the plans she had made for the baby, about the dreams she had kept hidden even from herself, because she didn't allow herself to imagine a different future. It was Gabriel who finally brought up the question that hung in the air between them. What would happen now? Marina was silent for a long moment, her hands resting protectively on her belly. The answer wasn't simple, not something that could be decided on a night of adrenaline and raw emotions. But as she looked at the wedding ring still on her finger, Marina felt something crystallize within her, a clarity that cut through the confusion and fear like a sharp blade. She wouldn't go back. No matter what Richard said, how many excuses he offered, how many promises he made, no matter the social pressure, the legal complications, the practical difficulties of undoing a shared life. With slow and deliberate movements, Marina removed the ring. The white gold ring with small embedded diamonds had been specially commissioned for her, designed by a famous jeweler, costing more than many people earned in a year. Richard always made a point of mentioning this, as if the material value of the object somehow compensated for the lack of respect and dignity in the relationship. Marina held the ring in her open palm, watching how the hospital's fluorescent light reflected on the facets of the diamonds. Then, with a definitive gesture, she placed it in the pocket of her hospital gown. She didn't throw it away in anger, didn't dramatically break it. She simply removed it, a symbolic but deeply significant act. Gabriel saw the gesture and understood everything it represented. He took his sister's hand, now free from the mark of that marriage, and squeezed it gently. He didn't say he was proud of her, didn't offer empty words of encouragement. He just stood there, a silent pillar of support, letting Marina know she was no longer alone. Morning arrived slowly, transforming the London sky from black to shades of grey, and then to a pale blue dotted with sparse clouds. Marina had finally managed to sleep a few hours, physically and emotionally exhausted. Gabriel had remained awake in the chair beside the hospital bed, refusing the nurse's suggestions to go home and rest. He wouldn't leave his sister alone, not now, not after everything. Around 8 in the morning, Dr. Lucy Rivers returned as promised. She was not alone. Beside her came Dr. Mark Anderson, a family law attorney who worked extensively with domestic violence cases. He was a man in his 50s, grey-haired, discreet glasses, and an expression that conveyed both competence and genuine compassion. After the formal introductions, Dr. Mark explained that there were several legal measures Marina could and should consider. First, and most urgent, was to request an emergency protective order. This would prevent Richard from approaching her, from contacting her directly or through third parties, and would create legal consequences if he tried to do anything. The process could be initiated immediately, especially considering the medical documentation and the dozens of witnesses to the previous night's event. Marina listened attentively, asking occasional questions as she processed the information. There was so much to consider, so many decisions to be made. Dr. Mark was patient, explaining each option without pressure, making it clear that she had complete control over how she wanted to proceed. Gabriel remained silent for most of the conversation, just observing, offering silent support through his presence. When Dr. Mark mentioned the divorce process, Marina felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of her was relieved to finally have a clear and concrete way out. But another part felt the weight of 4 years of her life that seemed to have been wasted, the shame of having to publicly admit that her marriage had been a failure, the fear of social judgment. As if reading her thoughts, Dr. Lucy leaned forward and spoke with a gentle firmness. She said Marina had nothing to be ashamed of, that leaving an abusive relationship was not failure, it was courage, that anyone who judged her for the situation was revealing more about their own character than about hers. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Marina felt resonate deeply within her. It was then that Gabriel finally spoke, his voice hoarse with fatigue but firm. He said their parents needed to know, that they had tried to contact him several times during the night, worried when they saw the first social media posts about the incident at the Grandeur Hotel. Gabriel had only replied, saying Marina was safe and that he would explain everything in the morning. But now, with the sun high in the sky, it was time to fully involve the family. Marina hesitated. The idea of facing her parents, of seeing the pain and concern in their faces, of admitting she had distanced herself from them for years, was almost unbearable. But she also knew Gabriel was right. She couldn't do this alone anymore. She needed her family, the entire support network she had neglected for so long. Paul and Helen Albright arrived at the hospital less than an hour later. Helen practically ran through the corridors, her high heels echoing against the linoleum floor as Paul tried to keep up with her hurried steps. When she saw Marina in the hospital bed, her face immediately contorted in a mixture of relief and anguish. She crossed the room and enveloped her daughter in a tight hug, murmuring words in English interspersed with sobs. Paul stood at the door for a moment, observing the scene, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was a normally reserved man who expressed affection through actions more than words. But at that moment, tears streamed freely down his face as he finally approached and embraced both his wife and daughter in his arms. Gabriel summarized the events of the previous night, sparing his parents the most painful details, but ensuring they understood the gravity of the situation. Helen held Marina's hand throughout the explanation, her grip tightening occasionally when particularly difficult parts were mentioned. Paul listened in silence, his jaw tense, his eyes fixed on some distant point as he processed the information. When Gabriel mentioned the 6 months he worked undercover at the hotel, Helen turned to him with an expression of surprise mixed with something that looked like maternal pride. Paul merely nodded slowly, as if it made perfect sense, as if he expected nothing less from his son when it came to protecting his sister. It was Helen who finally asked, the question everyone was thinking, but no one had verbalized. She asked Marina what she wanted to do, not about legal proceedings or protective orders, but about her life, where she wanted to be, how she wanted to move forward, what she needed to feel safe again. Marina was silent for a long moment, the words slowly forming in her mind before finding their way to her mouth. She said she wanted to go home, not to the apartment she shared with Richard, that space that had always seemed more like a showroom than a home, but to her parents' house, the house where she had grown up, where every room held memories of a time when she still knew who she was. Helen immediately replied that the house had always been hers, that her room was still exactly as she had left it, that she could stay as long as she needed. Paul added that they would provide everything she required, from additional security to continuous medical support. Dr. Mark, who had observed the entire family interaction with respectful silence, offered to coordinate the removal of Marina's personal belongings from the apartment so she wouldn't have to face Richard. As the adults discussed logistics and practical plans, Marina felt a subtle but significant shift within herself. For the first time in years, she was making decisions about her own life. These were not decisions based on fear or on trying to avoid someone's wrath. They were genuine choices about what she wanted, what she needed, how she wanted her future to unfold. The following days passed in a blur of constant activity. Marina was discharged from the hospital the next afternoon, but only after extensive examinations confirmed that both she and the baby were perfectly healthy. The emergency protective order was granted the same day, with a judge recognizing the urgency of the case given the circumstances and the number of witnesses. The media exploded with the story. Frederick Carter had published a detailed yet respectful article about the events at the Grandeur Hotel. The security camera video was not publicly released, but its existence was confirmed, which was enough to trigger a wave of reactions. Social media buzzed with discussions about domestic violence, corporate power, and the courage needed to leave abusive relationships. Richard tried to control the narrative, hiring an expensive public relations team to issue statements. That painted him as the victim of an elaborate setup. But with each attempt, more people emerged from the shadows with their own stories. Former employees who had been intimidated, business partners who had been manipulated, even a former girlfriend from years ago who had suffered similar treatment but never had the courage to speak publicly. Maxwell Developments began to feel the impact. Clients cancelled contracts, investors withdrew support. The company board called emergency meetings. Richard Maxwell's carefully constructed facade as a respectable businessman was crumbling stone by stone, revealing the rotten structure that had always existed underneath. Marina followed, everything from afar, from the safety of her parents' home in a gated community in Hampstead Heath. She had transformed her old bedroom into a temporary refuge, surrounded by objects from her adolescence that somehow made her feel more connected to herself. Helen spent hours with her every day, simply being present, offering tea and gentle conversations when Marina needed it, comfortable silence when she preferred. Gabriel had returned to his normal activities, but visited daily. He brought professionals to talk with Marina, from therapists specializing in trauma to financial consultants who helped her understand her rights and resources. Marina gradually began to rebuild her social network, reconnecting with friends she had neglected, accepting invitations for quiet lunches and walks in the park. 3 weeks after that night at the hotel, Marina had her first follow-up appointment with Dr. Patricia. The baby was developing perfectly, heartbeat strong and regular. During the ultrasound, the doctor casually asked if Marina wanted to know the baby's sex. She had refused to find out previously, wanting to keep it a surprise, as Richard had insisted. But now, looking at the black and white image on the screen, Marina realized she no longer wanted to follow someone else's preferences. She wanted to know. She wanted to be able to plan, imagine, connect more deeply with the life growing inside her. So she nodded, and Dr. Patricia smiled as she revealed it was a girl. A girl. Marina felt tears stream down her face as she watched the small figure on the screen moving gently. She would bring a daughter into the world, and this girl would grow up knowing that strength meant getting up when she fell, that dignity meant never accepting less than she deserved, that love never included fear or control. When Marina left the office, she found Gabriel waiting in the corridor. She didn't need to say anything. He saw in the sparkle of her eyes, in the way she instinctively protected her belly, that something had changed. She whispered to him that it was a girl, and Gabriel hugged her carefully, a genuine smile lighting up his face. They walked together to the parking lot, talking about possible names, about the baby's nursery that Helen was already planning, about the future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities instead of just obligations and fears. And for the first time in a long time, Marina allowed herself to feel something she had forgotten: hope. 3 months had passed since that night at the Grandeur Hotel, and Marina stood before the mirror in her parents' bedroom, observing her reflection with eyes that finally recognized the woman looking back. 9 months of pregnancy left her with a prominent belly, but there was something different beyond the obvious physical changes. It was the way she carried herself, the upright posture of her shoulders, the glint of determination in her eyes that had been absent for so long. The divorce was underway. Dr. Mark had proven to be an exceptional lawyer, navigating the legal processes with efficiency and sensitivity. Richard had tried to complicate everything, contesting every small detail, dragging out the proceedings, using every intimidation tactic he knew. But this time, he had no power over Marina. She was surrounded by a solid legal team, supported by her family, protected by judicial measures that ensured her safety. The story continued to reverberate in the British media. Frederick Carter had written a series of investigative articles about patterns of abusive behavior in high-power corporate environments. Several of Richard's former associates had given interviews, revealing questionable business practices and troubling personal conduct. Maxwell Developments was in freefall, with Richard being forced to step down from his CEO position as internal and external investigations proceeded. But Marina had consciously chosen not to focus on Richard's downfall. That was about him, his choices, his consequences. She was busy building something new, something that was entirely hers. With Gabriel's support and an initial investment from her parents, she had begun to develop a project close to her heart, a support center for women leaving abusive relationships. The center would offer not only legal and psychological support, but also professional training, financial assistance, and most importantly, a safe space where women could reconnect with themselves. Marina had used her own experience to shape the project, intimately understanding the needs, because she had lived that reality. She wanted to create the kind of resource she wished she had had when she was lost and alone. Helen gently knocked on the door before entering, bringing a cup of chamomile tea that had become a daily ritual between them. Her mother had become her greatest ally and confidant, their relationship flourishing in ways Marina hadn't imagined possible. They spent hours talking, not just about the immediate situation, but about everything: dreams, fears, regrets, hopes. Helen placed the cup on the bedside table and sat on the edge of the bed, observing her daughter with a mixture of love and admiration. She said something she had been wanting to say for weeks, that she was proud. Not just proud of the courage Marina had shown in leaving the relationship, but proud of the woman she was becoming, of the way she was transforming her pain into purpose. Marina felt tears sting her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that comes from gratitude and deep love. She sat beside her mother, and for the first time spoke openly about the years she had spent distant. She apologized for distancing herself, for not recognizing what was happening, for making them worry. Helen held her daughter's hands in hers and said there was nothing to forgive, that the important thing was that Marina was here now, alive, fighting, choosing herself, that the past could not be changed, but the future was full of infinite possibilities. They sat like that for a long time, simply existing in the same space, reconnected in a way that transcended words. Marina's phone vibrated with a message from Gabriel. He was on his way, bringing a surprise. Marina smiled, curious. Gabriel always had a talent for grand, surprising gestures. She dressed carefully, choosing a light blue cotton dress that comfortably accommodated her belly, and went down to the living room. When Gabriel arrived, he wasn't alone. With him came Beatrice Finch, Carlos Mendoza, Julia the hotel waitress, and surprisingly, Dr. Lucy Rivers. All carried gifts wrapped in colorful paper, warm smiles lighting up their faces. Gabriel explained that he had organized a surprise baby shower, but different from traditional ones. This would be a celebration not only of the arrival of little Laura, a name Marina had carefully chosen, but also of the journey of rebuilding and the community that had formed around that story. The afternoon passed in an atmosphere of genuine joy. Stories were shared, laughter echoed through the house, and Marina found herself surrounded by people who supported her unconditionally. Beatrice spoke about how witnessing Marina's courage had inspired her to examine her own relationships and behavior patterns. Carlos revealed that he had ended all business partnerships with Richard's company and was using his influence to promote more ethical business practices. Julia, the young waitress, shared that Marina's story had encouraged her to leave a relationship that had been worrying her. She thanked Marina for, unknowingly, being the catalyst for her own journey of self-discovery. Dr. Lucy announced that the British Business Leaders Association was implementing new policies on personal conduct and social responsibility, directly inspired by the events of that night at the hotel. Gabriel observed everything from a corner of the room, his heart full seeing his sister finally back, finally herself. He thought about the 6 months he had spent working anonymously, about the moments when he almost gave up the plan, about the risky gamble he had made that the right moment would eventually come. It had been worth it. Every second of waiting, every drop of forced patience, everything had been worth it to see Marina like this. As the guests began to leave in the late afternoon, Marina found herself alone with Gabriel in the garden of the house, sitting in the same hammock they used to use as children. The sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink that seemed almost unreal in their beauty. Marina turned to her brother and said the words she had been holding since that night. She thanked him, not just for intervening when she needed it, but for believing in her when she herself had stopped believing, for remaining patient when he could have forced the situation, for understanding that her journey needed to be hers, even if he was walking beside her the whole way. Gabriel simply smiled and said that's what siblings did, that he would always be there, not to save her because she was perfectly capable of saving herself, but to be the support when she needed it, the voice of reason when things got confusing, the constant presence that would remind her she would never be alone. A week later, Marina woke up at 4 a.m. with regular contractions. Helen immediately took her to the hospital, with Gabriel driving at a speed that technically exceeded the limits, but which no one dared to question given the circumstances. Paul followed in the car behind, his fingers drumming anxiously on the steering wheel. The delivery was long but uncomplicated. 12 hours later, as the sun set once more over London, Marina held her daughter in her arms for the first time. Laura had dark, curious eyes, a surprisingly abundant head of black hair for a newborn, and tiny fingers that firmly grasped her mother's index finger. Marina looked at that perfect little face and felt something expand in her chest, a wave of love so intense that for a moment she couldn't breathe. This tiny life would depend on her, trust her, learn to navigate the world through her eyes, and Marina silently swore that she would be the kind of mother her daughter deserved. Strong but gentle, firm but compassionate, someone who would teach by example that dignity and self-love were non-negotiable. Gabriel was the first besides the grandparents to hold Laura. He cradled her carefully, his eyes glistening as he looked at his niece. He whispered promises to that tiny creature, promising that he would always protect her, that he would always be her safe harbor, that she would grow up knowing she was unconditionally loved by an entire family. The following months brought their own series of challenges. Sleepless nights, the constant learning of motherhood, the ongoing divorce process that was finally concluded 6 months after Laura's birth. But through everything, Marina discovered she had a strength she didn't even know she possessed. A strength that didn't come from never falling, but from always getting up. The support center she had planned finally opened its doors a year after that transformative night. Marina named it Aurora House, symbolizing new beginnings and the light that comes after darkness. The space was welcoming but professional, decorated in soft tones that conveyed peace and security. There were therapy rooms, a small playground for children, a co-working space where women could work on their projects and rebuild careers. At the inauguration ceremony, Marina gave a speech that was widely shared on social media. She spoke about her journey, not with shame, but with raw honesty. She spoke about the signs she ignored, the years she lost, the fear that paralyzed her. But she also spoke about the hope she found, the strength she discovered, the life she rebuilt. She ended her speech looking directly at the camera recording the event and said something that would resonate with thousands of women watching. She said that leaving was not weakness. It was the bravest thing anyone could do. That asking for help was not defeat, it was wisdom. That starting over was not giving up, it was choosing herself. And that no relationship, no social position, no external pressure was worth more than one's own dignity and safety. As Marina finished speaking, with Laura in her arms and her family by her side, she looked at the people gathered and saw hope reflected in dozens of faces. She saw women who might see a little of themselves in her story. She saw allies who understood the importance of that space. And she saw finally the possibility of transforming her pain into something that could help countless other people. That night, when Marina put Laura to sleep in the crib beside her bed, she watched her daughter for a long moment. The little one slept peacefully, completely oblivious to the storms her mother had faced, the sacrifices that had been made, the journey that had brought her there. And that was exactly how it should be. Laura would grow up knowing only love, security, and the fundamental truth that she was valuable simply for existing. Marina gently touched her daughter's hair and whispered a promise. She promised that Laura would never have to choose between her own well-being and pleasing someone else, that she would grow up knowing that her emotions were valid, her boundaries were sacred, and her voice deserved to be heard. That she would learn early on that true love never asked you to become smaller, quieter, less yourself. And as Marina finally allowed herself to relax that night, lying in her own bed in the place she now called home, she realized something fundamental. She was no longer just the victim of a story of violence. She was the survivor who chose to rise. She was the woman who transformed trauma into purpose. She was the mother who would ensure that the next generation knew better, did better, was better. What had begun as the worst night of her life had transformed into the turning point that led her back to herself. And now, with each dawn, Marina woke up knowing that her story was still being written, and that each subsequent chapter would be of her own authorship. Dear listeners, we hope Marina and Gabriel's story has deeply touched your hearts, showing that the courage to start anew can emerge from the darkest moments. This narrative teaches us that protecting those we love sometimes means patiently waiting for the right moment, and that true strength lies in choosing one's own dignity above all else. If this story resonated with you in any way, If you saw in Marina a little of someone you know, or even of yourself, we ask you to share this content. To continue following stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the strength found in moments of transformation, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. Leave a like if Marina's journey inspired you, and tell us in the comments which moment of the story touched your heart the most. Every day we bring unique narratives that celebrate resilience, family love, and the human capacity to reinvent oneself. Your presence here makes all the difference, and every comment, every story shared in the comments creates a community of support and understanding. We look forward to seeing you in the next episodes, where we will continue exploring stories that remind us of the beauty and strength that exists in every new beginning.